I got a call from somebody very reputable who had been at the school in Bellevue and told me that one of their classmates had been sexually molested by Jeannie. I went and confronted her and said, "This is what I've heard. Is it true?" And used the names. And she started to sob and she said, "Yeah, it's true."
So she admitted to having a relationship with a child. Hello, everybody. Mike Donahue, Brian May, and we have a special guest, Eileen Delahanty Fires, is here with us today. Say hi, Eileen.
Hello.
So I love it, and you're going to see why. That Eileen is basically following up our Selling Shitty Jesus podcast. This isn't a part two. This is just a standalone, but she is following that up, which is great. Eileen, what did you think of that podcast?
I would have used some different language. However, gentlemen, I agree. And I'm not okay that people put programs over hearts.
I think what Mike's trying to say, everyone, is that Eileen's here to bring a little bit of class back to this podcast.
Right. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. We're going to class it up a bit by bringing her in. Um, so Eileen and I go way back. Brian does too. But my experience with Eileen is we both worked in high school ministry together in Sperino back in the 80s. Actually, we were talking about this today. Um, Eileen and I went out to lunch one day downtown Omaha, and this is how old we are. Mike Dukakis was running for president against Reagan. I'm from Boston. And so one of the reporters walked by, and I said, "Who is that, Mike Dukakis?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I'm from Weymouth." Well, about 5 minutes later, Eileen and I were just sitting there eating, and all of a sudden, Mike Dukakis comes over to our table and he goes, "Who's from Weymouth?" And we ended up chatting. It was small talk, political BS. But um,
I didn't tell him I was working on Reagan's campaign, but
that's right. Because after he left, you said that to me, and I was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you didn't say that." But yeah, so Eileen I go back into the youth group stuff. Eileen's a great woman of God. You're gonna really enjoy her perspective of things. She worked under Jeannie as well at the school. That's where Brian knows her. And then she actually went up to Rockford shortly after my ex-wife and I did, and she was there, actually lived in our house for a little while, and so did her husband. And so we go back. We got some roots, and so wanted to have her on the podcast because of those things, those reasons, that she goes back to to Bellevue and then also into Rockford, and had her experiences with Jeannie. And so, Eileen, I'm just going to, let you start it out, introduce yourself a little bit, who you are, what's going on, and then we'll just go from there.
well, I think you did a good job with the introductions. I was a teacher until Rockford. I Then I had 3 babies in a year. Figure out that math. And I have 3 great young men at this point. Actually, they're 30 and 29. And yes, I loved my years in Bellevue and in Rockford. Brian and I were having a conversation before the recording and talking about how there can be some really hard things that happen in a place, and yet you loved doing what you were doing, and working with my students, and the relationships I had with people were highlights of my life, and they were training grounds for other things that I did moving forward in different ministries that I was honored and privileged to be a part of. So yeah, it's been a long road. It's been a great road. And boy, I don't miss that young woman.
Yeah, sometimes I miss the youth, but not all of it. Right, right, right. And thank you for saying that. I think that's a really good point that we try to make often as we can on the podcast, is that um, nothing is 100% good, nothing is 100% evil, and even with all the things that have happened on our journeys, especially in relationship to Bellevue and Rockford, that there was good that came out of that, as well as there was a lot of not so good. So I think that's just a great underscore. So, I mean, where did it all start for you, Eileen?
Well, um, my parents decided when I was 12, I was young in school, and they decided that the school I was in was pretty dangerous, and they decided to pull me out. And they put me into Bellevue Christian Academy at the time. I was in middle of seventh grade, and I was just a prime candidate for all of this. Um, I was a high achiever. I wanted to be good, and I really believed that to be good, you did good. And I wanted to do the right thing, and not for anything but for right's sake. And that was just my wiring. Um, there's pros and cons with that, and with different personality tests that just keeps coming out, and that really has been the way my life has been. So again, I was a producer. I remember as a child, before I even started school, my parents put me in at 4. I taught myself to read because I was bored, and I asked for workbooks. So my parents, agreed. So coming into a system that the Bellevue system at the time, was very small. It was very, very small, Bellevue Christian. And we actually had some great teachers. And learning, especially on the English side, um, learning how to write and all of those types, and critical thinking, really high. It was really, really high. And to get into a classroom and to begin to write, and Jeannie was in the classroom a lot. She was at the school a great deal. And now I look back and I realize how young she was. And she was the superintendent. And as I'm cranking out work, which was just fun for me, I loved homework. I know I'm a freak. All of a sudden, I'm doing I'm doing this, what's expected of me, and doing the best that I can, and I'm getting affirmation. But not only that, I'm getting affection.
But talk about the dynamics of how, because as teachers, you and I both want to affirm students that are giving it the effort. I think I know you well enough to know that it's not necessarily about the level of achievement, but it's that they are putting themselves into it. And so affirmation is a good thing. Talk a little bit about how that the affection dynamic came into it.
She saw something that she wanted. Now, I was young, so I'm not sure what she saw. And, but I came from a military family where you did what was right. And why would anybody affirm that? Um, if you didn't do it, you're gonna get, there's gonna be consequences. And so having this non-nurturing environment that I had come from, to have someone who is full of life and charisma began to give me physical affection and emotional affection, created this link that shouldn't have been there. And affirmation would have been fine. I got affirmation when I was in school before, but it was this intense holding up my work as an example. That always scared me because it isolated me from my classmates. But somehow there it did not do that. And but it built this really strong, quickly built a very strong allegiance between us.
You and Jeannie.
Yes. And I loved her.
When you say physical, you're not talking about sexual stuff. You're talking about like the hugs, and you're talking about
Holding my hand when we're sitting someplace. But yes, it was the things that I hadn't experienced before, and certainly not in that kind of quantity and intensity.
would you consider that now grooming, or do you think I was genuine, or it was a combo?
I don't know. I think she was really young, and I think it might have been her getting some of her needs met as well.
Did that ever feel awkward to you? Did that always feel good to you? I mean, even in the moment.
The hugging wasn't awkward. Um, some of the hand holding was. With the background that I have, I desperately wanted healthy touch, but I was repelled by it as well. And I didn't have the voice to say no.
Why?
Just didn't have it yet.
So in that environment that you were in, obviously she was giving you special attention because you were a high achiever. You had tremendous potential. To her, I'm assuming, I'm attributing motive, but it seems like that that is the way. Uh, did you see that happen with other of your peers at the school that were like you?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. And there were a group of us that were high achievers, and we were all friends. And I think what I saw was that when we reached the age that we could go into Sperino, that those of us who became active in Sperino and were from the school, that she had already kind of curated this group that she was, and I don't want to use the word grooming, but she was, building leadership skills into at the school. And then we came over to the Sperino side. She's going to use all of that. And I remember in your book, Mike, you talked about the line at the organ after Sperino. I never ever had to wait in the line. And the older I got, I knew there was a line, but I also knew I didn't have to stand in that line.
And you were part of a small group of people. Really small fraternity of people that didn't have to stand in the line. And I wasn't in that group in Bellevue. I was in Rockford, but I wasn't in Bellevue.
And I look back on that now and I'm like, how arrogant I was and how horrible I feel because I knew there was a line and I really thought I had earned that right relationally, and I just worked hard. I did all the things that were expected, and so I felt like I had a special relationship with her. She told me I did, and so I accessed her. And now I did hear from other leadership that oh, that annoys her, but then I would ask and she would say no. So I never knew who was telling the truth.
I just think we talk a lot about patterns of behavior. And I think it's interesting that with different people at different times and different circumstances, we saw these patterns of behavior with her. She would identify someone who had potential. And I think what you said is really important. I'm just going to reiterate it. It was more than affirmation. It was more than saying, hey, you know what? You're really good at this and I want to help you grow. I mean, that's a healthy relationship. And again, as teachers, we've had those relationships with our students, but when it crosses over that line where there's that creation of this emotional attachment that I think that as I look back now, they didn't go off for me, but I wish those warning lights would have gone off for me at that time, because I think that really is the differentiator between sort of having a healthy mentor slash leader and being in an unhealthy relationship. Would you, any thoughts along that line?
Yes. I think even as a 12-year-old, I was able to see that I saw cracks, and I saw that things were not represented as accurately. Um, like I would hear one thing and then I would see it portrayed another way. I'm remembering specific incidents. It came to me yesterday when I was thinking about this, and I must have been in eighth grade, maybe ninth grade. Now, this was a private school. It was late 70s, early 80s. So it would have been 79 or 80 when this happened. And somebody had gotten in trouble. It was a girl. I don't know what this girl had done, but we were in the discipline. Like there was a room that was right next to the principal's room, but teachers could go in there and talk to students, and that was the discipline area. Corporal punishment was still part of the school. This girl, I don't know what happened, but we were in our classroom and it was right on the other side of the wall. And it was a female teacher and she was using the paddle or whatever she was using. And we could hear, we could hear the spanking, and we could hear the screams, and we could hear the teacher getting angrier and yelling. And it just kept going on and on and on. And we were all like, oh my gosh, somebody's dying. And some of us started crying. And finally, whoever was the teacher in that room left the room and went to the principal's office, and it stopped. And I remember everybody was talking, somebody's going to get fired for this. And then, of course, we all found out who it was. And she was bruised terribly on her buttocks and her legs. And that teacher did not get fired. And I remember how bad, but she wasn't the one. Jeannie was not the one. She was the superintendent. She didn't come and deal with it. There was a huge uprising with the parents. It was the principal that had to deal with it. Isn't it her job? And why isn't this other teacher fired? Because she did it in anger, and she hurt a kid.
Did you ever feel a time when you felt like, hey, and maybe this time was one of those times, like this is not right, yet you had that conflict because you had this emotional bond built that created this loyalty? Could you talk about that for a minute?
So that was so hard for me because not only was it you can't you can't push authority, but it was somebody I loved, who I thought loved me, and I was special.
That early on, those kinds of behaviors that we've seen persist through this whole story. were manifested. I mean, this isn't something that came along all of a sudden years later. I mean, this is something that started early and grew and grew and grew.
I have, and even while I was in Bellevue and in Rockford, one of my side hustles that I don't get paid for, I did for a little while. Um, I have worked in the field of trauma for 35 years, and it wasn't something I signed up for. It came to me, and it wasn't something that anybody talked about back then. And it was something that it came to me, so I started figuring it out, reading anything I can get my hands on. And so I will say this. Am I a psychologist? No, I'm not. But what I understand, and this is public information, so I'm not speaking out of turn. Jeannie's talked about the fact that she's had abuse in her childhood. And one of the things that is so, it does happen. It doesn't happen for every single person that has experienced abuse. And not everyone who experiences abuse moves into more complicated forms of trauma. But abuse is trauma. And as if you don't deal with it, if you don't walk through healing and transformation is the big thing, and it takes time. If you don't do that, one of two things happens: you self-destruct, or you repeat the patterns, and you do them innately. It's not conscious. Eventually you learn, and she's so smart, eventually you learn, oh, if I do this, this is what happens, and it becomes more cognizant. But I think in the early days, it was survival for her.
Well, she's famous for she's famous for using the much repeated quote, hurt people, right? And we understand that in large part that is what's going on here. And as you mentioned, we'd love to take a deeper dive in the trauma angle of this, because I really think there's a lot of people who share a piece of all three of our experience that can really help give a window on what they're going through, and that's worthy of a long discussion. Um, I do want to ask another question though that's going to kind of turn from that. So, but we're gonna come back to that in the future, folks out there in TV land. So we feel like we got a lot to talk about there with Eileen and her experience and her expertise. But I'm curious what it was like. So you had this experience as a young lady, a young girl, and a young woman going through the school, seeing how the sausage was made there from being the student side. Then you went to work in that system. What was that like?
I was in love. I loved everything about it. I loved the classroom. I loved teaching so much. I loved my students. I didn't like my hours. And I remember being in the gym, Brian, and be working with the cheerleaders, and I remember watching you with your briefcase walk across the gym out the back door where you know some of our parking was, and think, I wish I could leave. I wish that was me, because it'd be like around 4 o'clock, and I'd be like, he has time probably to read the paper.
But it was all but the manipulation part of it is this is for Jesus, and quite frankly, she worked really hard. I mean, full disclosure, she never went home. So, I mean, she was always there as well. And so you felt that was the leverage kind of, you felt guilty about saying anything to her because 'cause I mean, I didn't work at the school, but I worked at the youth group, and it was the same thing. I worked 60, 70 hours a week, and you couldn't say, "Hey, I need a break to be with my family," or "I need some quiet," "Oh, you should start quoting, Jim Elliott quotes of, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep, the game again." We'd hear all these different it's basically propaganda to keep you in that funnel.
And it was easier for me because I was single and I liked my life. I liked what I was doing, and I had friends, and I didn't like the amount of work I was doing. And in fact, I actually had um, the first summer in between my first and second year, I had a nervous breakdown. And I mean, I wasn't institutionalized, but it was right before going back to school, and I was sobbing for over a week. I couldn't stop about going back to school. And then I sucked it up and put my big girl panties on and went back to school.
Well, I was gonna say, you left Bellevue,
Went on the mission field.
you went on mission field, and then got hired to go back up to Rockford and or go to Rockford and teach, and I was a big part of that. We, you know, kinda talked you into it. So don't hate me.
I don't.
So I was really excited actually when you were coming up because I worked in the school.
And I was good friends with Andrea.
Yeah. So my job was I was the spiritual life director of the high school, and I knew you were coming in to be a teacher there, and I was really excited about that. And at that time, my eyes hadn't been fully opened I worked for Jeannie in Bellevue as an intern, but I really didn't work for her. I was under Rick, and we've made that pretty clear on this podcast. But and Rick, give or take, whatever, he was a good dude at the time. I mean, there was um a good working relationship that I had with him. And I remember him saying to me and he helped orchestrate me, getting the job. He helped get me the job. But I remember him saying to me, be careful because not everything is what you think. And I didn't know what he meant by that. And then a couple of years into it, I did know what he meant by that because I started to see some inconsistencies, some lies, manipulation. All of a sudden, people would be gone. I'm like, why are they gone? And then you'd hear it was almost like the mafia. I mean, you'd hear like stories of people, just disappearing, right? They just stopped coming, and you know, so that they I think the lights were coming on for you at the same time. I might have been a little ahead of you, but because I was there longer, but before you. But can you describe the Rockford stuff and how it kind of the disappointment of seeing behind closed doors?
I had turned the job down 3 times. Larry Goodrich was the principal at the time, and it was a situation of you're going to teach 5 classes, 6 classes. And I was doing that on the mission field. I had done that in Bellevue, and I was like, that is just not a healthy way to live, and I'm not doing it again. And so Jeannie actually was like, no, you need to come. And I was like, no, I'm not coming. And so she talked me into flying in. She paid to fly me to Chicago and had somebody pick me up and come see the school and get interviewed by Larry again in person. And when I was flying in, I got a call from somebody very reputable who had been at the school in Bellevue and told me that one of their classmates had been sexually molested by Jeannie. Now, again, this is hearsay. I have no proof of this. Um, and that I shouldn't go because this was the MO.
So just to be clear, because I want to make this clear, you're not saying that. You're saying you heard that somebody who was reputable said to you, "Hey, be careful because Jeanne Mayo, she actually molested. She had a sexual relationship with a child, with a student. Okay.
Yes. And it wasn't a be careful, it was don't go. So I I was devastated by that. And yet, when you know in your gut, when somebody tells you something, you go, that checks out. From all the things I've seen, it checks out. And so the tickets had already been purchased. And so my thought was, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to confront her. I don't know who I thought I was, this little 24-year-old. What did I know? And I had stayed, she wanted me to stay at her house. And so I did, but Andrea wanted me to stay at her and Mike's house. So I stayed a couple days at Jeannie's. I was not going to confront her while I was staying there. So then when I moved over to Mike and Andrea's, I said, I called this guy and said, listen, I'm going in to confront her. I need you to be praying. I really like it here. I I love the people, but this could get really ugly. And my rear end may be on a plane like in a few hours. And Mike did. He had overheard the conversation, and he came in. He goes, "Listen, whatever you're talking about, you know, you need to be here, and I need you here, and she needs you here, and I'm sure that it's not what you're being told." And I remember looking at him going, "I'm sorry, but you don't know what you're talking about."
And to be clear, she's talking about me. So
So I did go and confront. I went and confronted her and said, "This is what I've heard. Is it true?" And use the names. And she started to sob and she said, "Yeah, it's true."
so she admitted to having a relationship with a child.
And mhm, yeah. And I don't know if she was like, she might have said, "Oh, he was 18," or "Oh," but I think that might have been, I don't know, but I think that might have been pushing lines. I think that might have been not true. And only he would be able to tell. Um, and this other individual, but, and his group of friends that it happened to. Yes. But she told me, "Yep, it happened. I've told Sam, and um, I have repented before the Lord, and I was invited to speak at the National AG conference this year, first woman, and it was a really big deal, and I turned it down as um,
Penance, like a punishment.
yeah, for what happened, and nothing like that's ever happened, and nothing like that's ever going to happen again." And I I don't know why I decided to say yes to teaching there, but I didn't trust her, but I loved her still.
Just for some backup for you on that, um, it's you said this to me, Eileen, after the Julie Roy's report that I did, the podcast I did, and I was trying to explain to her the intoxication and the draw that Jeannie has, and she said, "Oh, I've met people like that." And I remember you saying to me, "She has no idea what she's talking about." Like, and no offense to Julie Roy's, but unless you meet Jeanne Mayo, you don't understand. She has incredible enmeshment powers. I don't know what they're called, but they're very intoxicating. They draw you in, and she could tell you that she just beat up your best friend, and you'd feel like she was the victim somehow. I don't know how she does it, but it's crazy.
I've said often that she has skills that the biggest cult leaders in the world would envy. I mean, she is really good at what she does. Yeah.
And my eyes were open then. And so it was at that point that as I would see things, I would call them out when I was teaching there. And that did not make me a popular girl.
Can you give us any kind of example of that?
At this point, I had gained favor with my students, and I was grateful for that. And I really, really loved my students. And with that comes a lot of responsibility. And they would share things that as a teacher, and I always told them this, listen, I'm not here to keep your secrets. I'm here to keep you safe. I'm a mandatory reporter. And they knew that, and they would still come. And there were a couple of instances when um, I I had I had to call the Child Protective Services, and then I was an administrator at that point, half teacher, half administrator. Then I would inform the admin team, because
So you call the police first, or call the child protective services first, and then you told.
yeah, because we met every morning, and boy, I would be told that is not your responsibility, and you need to tell me first. This is Jeannie, and I'll handle it. It's not you. No. And I was just like, well, actually, the law says I have to report it because I was told. And my responsibility to you is to inform you because you're the head of the organization. And I am not going to apologize for that. But I also, in my head, was like, you're not going to report.
Well, yeah, you're right. Go back to patterns of behavior. I mean, we don't know, but we can sort of deduce that, right? Um, so, how did that affect your dynamic with her after this happened? I'm assuming this happened more than once.
I began to be pushed out of the inner circle more and more. And there was a period of time, probably the last year I was teaching, didn't know it was my last year, but um, you have twins, you're not coming back, not the next year. Um, she brought in, and I don't know why, um, sh- they had interns in the church, and these kids did not have any education outside of a high school degree. Some of them had a couple years, at Bible school, but she was putting these interns into the classroom. And I was like, wait, what? And my husband, he was teaching a Bible class. Well, he went to Bible school and had that under his belt. So that was appropriate. But you don't teach core classes because you have a high school diploma. And I remember going straight to her because she was the superintendent. Not, I mean, I went to the principal at the time, Roger Berry. He's like, it's not my call. So then I went to her, and I was like, what are you doing? You can't do this. How is this even legal? And she was like, you need to keep quiet, and you need to, this is fine, and they're doing great. And I'm like, and they're under supervision. I'm like, whose supervision? Because I was the supervisor for all new teachers for 2 years. And she's like, mine. And I said, you're making a huge mistake.
So parents were paying tuition to have their sons and daughters taught English, math, whatever.
Yeah, I don't know what the subjects were.
Well, I know one of them was math because I know one of the guys was. I know Brian Massenger was one teaching math, and he had just graduated from high school. So,
And I had heard rumors of one of our students who raped another student during a basketball game in the school. And but I didn't know who it was. And years later I got a message from the girl, and she told me the story, and she got pregnant.
from that incident,
Um it was pretty bad.
wow.
So the police were not involved, and it was covered up.
So Jeannie knew about it.
Yeah, she certainly did. Because they no, she did nothing. The boy had been recruited to come in and play basketball.
Wow. And so all that was covered up, and the police were never called. She had the baby.
She's a therapist now.
Wow, I bet she is. Isn't it funny how that follows itself, kind of? These people that end up having so much trauma, they end up in trauma therapy or in some kind of occupation that does that. So, Eileen, there's been accusations from people that I can't talk about um, in the on this podcast because they haven't given me permission to do that. But they were up in Rockford, and they were students that were molested, allegedly molested by staff members, and Jeannie knew about it and covered it up. Some of which you may be talking about, but I think there's a couple that that happened before, right when you got there. So um, that's just heinous. I mean, and what Brian and I have talked about this before about how really what that comes down to is covering the brand. Like they were really afraid that the school was going to get exposed. So, so it hurt the bottom line basically. Because, Christian schools enrollment, Christian schools promote to the community, we have better kids than you do. So, I mean, really, that's the crudest way to say it. But, send your kid here because we'll produce better kids. And that's really not true. But what happens to the kids is they become these trophies, right? They have to behave a certain way, act a certain way. And so if something like that comes along and we find out that a staff member is molesting students, well, then they're not safe. Or if students are on students and that's happening too, they're not safe. And so let's cover all of this up so nobody sees this. What do you think of that?
Unconscionable. Unconscionable. As I've worked with different organizations and churches, when there has been an incidence with sexual molestation um, of young people, and they're like, what do we do? What do we do? And the first thing that I do say to them is, you come out and protect the victim first, and don't worry about the institution. God will cover that. And the world will see that, because they want you to cover the victim.
You were Jen Christensen's cheerleading coach.
Yeah, and I taught her for her junior and senior year.
So when you saw that podcast with her coming on and talking about what happened with her with the basketball coach, I mean, that must have devastated you. I mean, just from a personal point of view.
It did. Yeah. And when I found out about it, which I found out about it when I came back from the mission field, I was so angry because I worked with him. And in fact, when he first started teaching it at Bellevue Christian, his first year was he taught my class. And when I was a student, and the things that he taught us about character, and they were true. He just didn't live them. And it was just pathetic.
All right. So to wrap this up, Eileen, I would like you to just tell us personally the effect it had on you, because you were Jeannie's girl. Like, everybody knew that. I mean, you were Jeannie's girl. I mean, I'm in a small fraternity of guys that were like, recently somebody said we were like the third son, right? It was Josh, Justin, and then, she would put, manipulatively speaking, she would put people in that third son spot. And I would definitely say I was in that spot. But you were sort of the first girl that I know, and there's been a couple after you, but I don't know if anybody ever got as deep as you did. So when the lights came on and you saw how heinous and how selfish, really what it comes down to is it's pretty much selfishness and narcissistic. Um, what did it do to the inside of you?
It shut me down completely. It was like a bomb went off internally. There was the rejection, the betrayal, I internalized it of what's wrong with me. But as somebody who has complex trauma, complex PTSD, of course that's going to be my trauma response. It has led to not trusting women, and I've had to really work hard to have relationships with women. I don't I still have issues with women in power in the church because I want to know what's their agenda.
That all of us have stories, and there's common threads here, right? And there's themes, and there's shared experiences. And it's not just the three of us. I mean, as I say often on this podcast, if you're out there, if you were part of the scene at BCA, BCH, Bellevue Christian Center, Rockford, anywhere else, you've heard stories over and over again on this podcast told by different people. Um, I'm just going to say it again. My favorite thing to say to all of you is just realize it's not you, it is them. And if there is anything we can do to help, if you just need someone to speak to, if we can help you find resources to maybe deal with some of the things that are coming up in you for watching these things, that's what we're here for. The number one reason that Mike and I are doing this podcast, and I think the number one reason Eileen agreed to come on, is that we realize that there are people out there who've got some pain to process, and who need to find some healing, who would love to find some healing. And that's why we're here. So thank you, Eileen, for coming on.
Been my pleasure. Not
And
pleasure,
the
that's the
other
wrong word. Honor.
the other thing, and just to piggyback on that, is to say that that's one of the reasons why we want Eileen back on, because we're gonna we're going to discuss some of those things, some specific things you can do in the church abuse, world. And she's trained, and then also has this shared experience. So who better than to bring on and talk about this? And we'll get more down the road, on that later. But thank you so much, everybody, for coming on and listening to this podcast. A little longer than usual. We knew it was going to be, because, hey, when you have a special guest like this, you got to accommodate. So we're doing that. So Eileen, thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on as well. And everybody, will see you on the Groomed at 10, or Groomed.com. What did we call it, Brian? Groomed in 10 on Thursday. We'll wrap this up. All right. Take care, you guys. Have a good night.